Welcome back. In this tutorial, we will export our modified level set piece using both plugins, pointing out some differences in how each one works and the results they generate. Let's begin. Here's something you should be aware of when using this plugin. When you import an asset from Torchlight 2 using this plugin, it is actually rotated on the X-axis by 90 degrees. Normally you wouldn't want this, but for some reason this plugin imports it that way, and it expects it to be that way when exported. So if you correct this with using Control A to get rid of that rotation but keep its transform, then when you export it, it won't be right if you use this particular plugin. Now you could do that and export it with the other Ogre exporter, and we probably will do that, but just you want to keep in mind which exporter you're using and how it was created. If I had created this asset from scratch, it would not have been rotated this way, and I would actually need to rotate it before exporting using this particular plugin. Let's turn off our lock camera to view. I don't even need to be in the camera view. For this one, I just want to have the catacomb floor. Go to our Torchlight 2 plugin. Before I get too much farther, I want to go ahead, make sure I have this in my buffer. I'm going to save this file. I'm giving it the same name as the primary asset that we edited. Now we are ready to export our models to the Ogre format. First, we can walk through using the pink vertex exporter and then the Ogre Cave exporter. Make sure that you have the model selected in the outliner that you want to export. Now on our Torchlight 2 tab on the 3D view, we have 3 buttons for exporting meshes: Weapon, Wardrobe, and Monster. Nothing about level sets, but that's okay. A weapon mesh isn't expecting a rig like a wardrobe or monster mesh would. We can use that one. Click on the Export Weapon Mesh button. Let's make an export folder just so we have some organization, keep our exported files separate from our master blend file and source graphic. Because we're exporting with the pink vertex exporter and we want to compare that to the Ogre Cave exporter, I'm actually going to make an export PV folder. We'll use this to store our future pink vertex exporter meshes. Make sure you give your mesh a name. It is good practice to make it the same name as what we specified in the Properties window. This will be what it actually gets loaded into Torchlight as. Finally, click the Export Torchlight 2 Weapon Mesh button in the upper right. As long as you don't see any errors and you gave your mesh a name, it should be exported to the folder specified. Let's check. Here is my project folder with the Export PV folder, and inside there is the mesh we exported. I'm going to double click this to open it in Ogre Meshy. As you can see, it does not have its texture applied. Now the exporter we used doesn't export material files. So we would have to create the material file it's looking for by hand. A good way of doing that is just, since we edited an existing asset, is just to copy that material file here and rename it, especially since we're using the same texture. And if we want to see the texture applied, we'll also need the texture image in this folder. I've pulled over the folder that has the assets where we started from. We're going to want this catacomb material. And if I open this, we can see that the material is now defined, but it can't locate the PNG. In this case, it wants floor 01 PNG. I don't see a PNG, but there is a DDS. Let's copy the DDS. We want to be able to preview, so I will go ahead and change it to a PNG file. Now if I double click this to open an Ogre Meshy, I have the texture applied to our modified mesh. We should also export our collision model. We'll do the same process as before, but we won't have to worry about a texture or a material file. Make sure to rename the export to collision, otherwise you'll overwrite your mesh that you've already exported. Now when I look in my export folder, I see that I also have the collision mesh. That looks pretty good as well. I'm noticing that we have the collision stone material, but I'm not seeing the other material. This exporter only exports one material. That's not going to work for the way this collision was set up. We could make two separate collision meshes, but what I've done with other assets is to use the other exporter because it can export a multi-material mesh. To demonstrate what I mean by exporting two different meshes for the collision, I can come in and select just the material for the no collide. And then what I can do is to separate it by selection or material. Before I get too carried away though, I want to keep this as is so I can demonstrate the other exporter. So what I'm going to do is to duplicate that collision into a different one. Now what I can do is to separate this one into two separate meshes. Select by material, P, selection. If I come up here, hide my original one, I can now look and see if I hide, I need to hide this one as well, but if I hide the floor, that's gone, and if I hide this other part that is the no collision, no collide, That one's gone. We should probably clean up these materials if we're going to do it this way, so that we only have one material assignment per object. That looks good. Let's go ahead and export these again. I'm just going to override the collision mesh I made the first time. Now I'll select the second one and export, but I don't want to override this. What I'm going to do is to add an _B to it, indicating that it's a barrier. This is just something I came up with pretty much right now, but it seems like, just a way to make sure that it stays related, but that you know that it has some other meaning. And we can actually use this way inside the Guts engine, and I'll demonstrate that later. Back over to our export folder, I now have my collision for the floor piece, and my collision for the barrier that we can't walk through. Now I want to demonstrate the other plugin for exporting, the one from Ogre Cave. I want to reset my scene to like what it was before, so I'm going to hide the new collision meshes. I'm going to show the original collision mesh, and I'm going to show my original texture mesh. To use this plugin, you will come up to File and Export, and then down here to Ogre 3D. I want to create a new folder. I'm calling this one Export OC for Ogre Cave. Normally when I'm working, I just have a single export folder. I'm just doing this to highlight the differences between the two export methods. As you can see, this plugin has a lot of options down here. Many of these we won't use, but there are some options we really want to pay attention to, especially for our levels here. And that's going to be this export materials, export meshes overwrite, and there should be export selected only. Now, I didn't select but one single mesh. This exporter can actually export multiple meshes at the same time. I'm going to cancel, come back to my scene. Now I have the new collisions we made, hidden, and I have the original two shown. So if I just press A, let me make sure now press A. I have both of the textured and the collision selected. So now when I come in and go to export and make sure that I'm in that same folder, I can do my export and it'll export all of those meshes, and it gives me an update. It has two meshes. Let's go check that folder. Here's my project folder, and here's the export folder. Notice this made a lot more files than what the other plugin did. We have our material, we have the DDS, we have two different meshes. We have the XML it used to generate those meshes. So first, I'm going to load up our textured mesh. And there it is. Everything looks fine. Got the texture. Looks good. Now we'll load up the collision mesh. And here it is. Notice it's not complaining about any missing material files or anything of that nature. And if I come up and look in the materials, both the collision stone and the no collide materials are on this mesh. I can use this one mesh to do both of those collision types. I've tried this with other assets I've worked on, and it's worked pretty good. Before we get too much further, I wanted to highlight some of the differences that the Ogre Cave plugin had when exporting its materials and the mesh itself. The big thing to see is that the material name that's based off of the material as it is in Blender has been changed in the Ogre Cave exporter. This should be a slash. There's no reason it can't be a slash, but the exporter converts all the slashes into underscores. So if you're going to use this exporter and you want it to match the naming convention within Torchlight 2, which is especially important on materials where there's replacement, as in a player, then you're going to have to come in and hand edit these material files and the XML files for the meshes to correct these material names and then run them through that Ogre XML converter before you can use them in Torchlight. The other thing you should be noticing is that while the Torchlight 2 material is pretty small, fits in a very small space here, just a few options, the material that was exported from Blender is quite large and has a lot more options on it. And a lot of this is not needed and would actually, while some of them will work, it will change how it looks rendered in Torchlight. And since we want this material to match what is already in Torchlight, if you do make another material file, you should probably just copy the section you need and make your own material file, as opposed to trying to use what the Ogre Cave plugin exported. We just learned how to export a level set piece from Blender using both the Pink Vertex exporter and the Ogre Cave exporter. We also learned about the differences between the different plugins and about each one's strengths and weaknesses. In the next tutorial, we will be loading our new assets into the Torchlight 2 mod editor, Guts.